The American West is often romanticized as a land of freedom and brave pioneers. But behind that image lies a harsher reality, one defined by displacement, conflict, and systemic injustice. As settlers moved west, indigenous peoples faced forced removal, cultural erasure, and state-sanctioned violence. These weren't isolated events. They were part of a broader pattern, documented in newspapers, government records, and personal accounts. Painful as they are, these truths are essential to understanding the real legacy of the West. Massacres, when conquest turned deadly. In many parts of the frontier, organized attacks on native communities became a tragic and recurring feature of westward expansion. These events were often carried out under military command and disproportionately affected civilians, especially women, children, and the elderly. One of the most notorious examples occurred in the year 1864 at Sand Creek, in what was then Colorado Territory. A group of Cheyenne and Arapaho, having been assured of safety by U.S. officials, set up camp near Fort Lyon. But at dawn, troops led by Colonel John Chivington launched an unprovoked assault. More than 230 people were killed, the vast majority of them unarmed non-combatants. First-hand accounts describe scenes of chaos and devastation that shocked even some military observers at the time. Another tragedy unfolded in 1890 at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. During a tense attempt to disarm a group of Lakota Sioux, soldiers from the 7th Cavalry opened fire. In the confusion, more than 150 Lakota men, women, and children lost their lives. Many had been attempting to surrender or flee. In 1863, at Bear River in present-day Idaho, U.S. troops attacked a Shoshone camp in the middle of winter. Reports from that time estimate 250 to 500 casualties, making it one of the deadliest assaults on indigenous people in U.S. history. Yet, it remains less known than others. These events were not always met with condemnation. In some cases, they were even celebrated in local newspapers or by military officials. Public parades, promotions, and headlines often followed. Such responses sent a clear message that territorial expansion was seen as justification for even the most extreme measures. Killing the buffalo meant killing the people. For many indigenous nations of the Great Plains, such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Kiowa, the buffalo was far more than food. It was central to spiritual practice, daily survival, and cultural identity. Every part of the animal had use: meat for nourishment, hides for shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread. When the buffalo herds vanished in the late 1800s, it wasn't just due to overhunting. In part, it was intentional. As tensions grew between Plains tribes and the U.S. government, military leaders came to see the destruction of the buffalo as a way to weaken resistance. General Philip Sheridan reportedly endorsed efforts to exterminate the herds, making relocation to reservations more likely. Commercial hunters arrived by the thousands, often firing from trains and leaving carcasses to rot. Though hides were sold, much of the meat was wasted. From an estimated 30 million buffalo in the 1860s, only a few hundred remained by 1880. This collapse shattered indigenous life. Tribes lost food, shelter, mobility, and ceremony. Many were pushed into unfamiliar regions where farming was difficult and game scarce. Malnutrition and poverty followed. For Native communities, the loss of the buffalo was more than ecological devastation. It was cultural destruction. And for many, it was understood not as tragedy, but as deliberate control through deprivation. Disease as a weapon, the legacy of smallpox and contamination. The arrival of European diseases in the Americas had devastating effects on indigenous populations. Illnesses like smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly through communities with no prior immunity, leading to widespread suffering. While many outbreaks were unintentional, historical records suggest disease was sometimes used in calculated ways. A well-known example occurred in 1763 during Pontiac's Rebellion, when British officers at Fort Pitt reportedly discussed giving smallpox-infected blankets to the Lenape. Although this predates westward expansion, the mindset of using disease to weaken resistance reappeared in later years. Throughout the 1800s, smallpox outbreaks continued to strike indigenous nations, especially the Mandan, Arikara, and Blackfeet. These epidemics were often made worse by neglect, delayed aid, or discriminatory policies. Vaccinations were sometimes denied. Quarantine measures were inconsistently applied or withheld altogether. There are also oral histories describing contaminated food and water left behind after raids or forced relocations. Survivors recalled sudden illness after receiving unfamiliar or spoiled supplies. While not always documented in official records, these accounts reflect a broader pattern of disregard during periods of crisis. Whole villages were decimated, elders passed without passing on knowledge. Families and traditions were fractured. Whether by mismanagement or neglect, the impact of disease was far-reaching and deeply felt. This part of history highlights how policy and care, or the absence of both, could shape the fate of entire communities. Cash for scalps. When violence became policy. In many popular accounts, scalping is portrayed as a brutal practice linked to native warriors. Less often acknowledged is the fact that colonial and early American governments encouraged it by offering monetary rewards. From the 1700s into the 19th century, several states and territories paid bounties for the scalps of native people. These payments were sometimes intended for enemy combatants, but often no distinction was made between fighters and civilians. The policy was described as a form of defense, yet it frequently led to organized violence. One of the earliest examples was in Massachusetts in 1745, where authorities paid £100 for the scalp of a native male over the age of 12. As expansion continued, similar bounty systems appeared in Texas and the Southwest. In California, during the 1850s, the state authorized militias to pursue native communities. Local counties advanced funds, which the state later reimbursed. Public records from this period describe settlers forming expeditions and then requesting compensation for scalps or other proof. In some cases, additional body parts were submitted as evidence. These actions were recorded in newspapers and official documents. Between 1851 and 1865, California spent over $1 million on such operations. Many of these campaigns targeted non-combatant communities. This policy did not represent isolated aggression. It was part of a wider system that turned violence into official procedure. Trails of tears and broken promises. The term Trail of Tears is most often linked to the 1838 removal of the Cherokee Nation from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States. However, this was only one part of a much larger policy of forced relocation that lasted throughout the 19th century, affecting dozens of indigenous nations and displacing tens of thousands of people. Beginning with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the U.S. government moved native communities westward through treaties that were often signed under pressure and later violated. The Cherokee were among the most visible victims. Around 16,000 were forced to leave Georgia, and about 4,000 died from disease, exposure, and starvation. Similar removals affected the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. As settlers pushed further west, the same pattern continued. Tribes from fertile regions were moved to distant reservations, with poor soil, limited resources, and harsh living conditions. Promised supplies often arrived late, or not at all. By the end of the century, over 370 treaties had been signed between the U.S. and native nations. Nearly all were broken or reinterpreted, especially when valuable resources were discovered. These removals were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger strategy that reshaped communities and left long-lasting impacts on native life, land, and culture. The California Campaign: Expansion at a Cost. When California joined the Union in 1850 as a free state, That freedom did not apply to the indigenous people who had lived there for generations. In the years following the gold rush, the state launched one of the most aggressive campaigns of territorial expansion and removal in U.S. history. The arrival of settlers seeking gold and land created intense pressure on Native communities. Tensions rose not just over resources, but over indigenous presence itself. In 1851, Governor Peter Burnett declared that conflict would continue until the Native population was gone. That same year, the legislature authorized militias to remove Native people from lands claimed by settlers. These militias were officially organized and publicly funded. County governments documented expenses for weapons, supplies, and personnel. In some cases, payments were issued for the capture or killing of Native individuals. The state later reimbursed counties, creating a system that supported forced removal through financial incentives. Between 1851 and 1865, California spent over $1 million on such efforts. Many operations targeted peaceful villages. Some survivors, including children, were placed into indentured servitude, under laws that permitted forced labor. From 1846 to 1873, the Native population in California dropped from about 150,000 to fewer than 30,000. While illness and hunger played a role, official policies and violence were central to that loss. Starving the survivors. Control through deprivation. Even after forced relocations and military campaigns ended, many Native communities continued to face severe hardship. Life on reservations was marked not by stability, but by scarcity. One of the main tools of control during this time was the restriction of food. Treaties and relocation agreements included promises of regular supplies, such as food, blankets, and tools. These were to be distributed through the Indian Affairs system. In reality, deliveries were often delayed, reduced, or arrived spoiled. Corruption among government agents was widespread. Goods were diverted for profit, or withheld entirely. In some cases, food was used as leverage to force compliance. Communities that resisted new land agreements or government demands sometimes found their rations suspended. A particularly harsh example occurred in 1864 during the Long Walk of the Navajo. After being forced to march hundreds of miles to Bosque Redondo, over 8,000 Navajo were confined to poor land, with little water and failing crops. Hunger and disease soon followed. This pattern repeated in later decades. On northern plains, reservations during the 1870s and 80s, children and elders were especially vulnerable. Some shipments were replaced with rancid meat, or canceled without explanation. Official reports often downplayed the suffering. For many, hunger became more than hardship. It was experienced as a deliberate method of control. Cultural erasure by force. For indigenous communities, survival meant more than physical endurance. It meant preserving languages, ceremonies, beliefs, and ways of life that had been passed down for generations. But during the 19th century, many U.S. policies and religious efforts viewed these cultural foundations not as traditions to be respected, but as obstacles to be removed. As settlers moved westward, sacred sites were often taken over or destroyed. Ceremonial grounds were converted to farmland, mined, or otherwise restricted. Important religious objects were confiscated or lost. In many cases, the spiritual core of a community was deliberately displaced along with its people. One striking example comes from the Black Hills of South Dakota, where the Lakota Nation held Bear Butte and other mountain formations as sacred. These places were central to spiritual practice, including vision quests and prayer. When gold was discovered in the area, the U.S. government violated earlier treaty agreements and opened the land to settlers and mining operations. The resulting conflict was not just over resources, it was over the desecration of holy ground. Religious expression itself came under legal attack. In 1883, the Bureau of Indian Affairs introduced the Religious Crimes Code, a set of regulations that banned many traditional ceremonies and spiritual practices. Indian agents were given the authority to intervene, often using threats of punishment to suppress cultural rituals. Some communities were warned that practicing their beliefs could result in the loss of rations or other essential supplies. Traditional healers, sometimes labeled as medicine men, were increasingly treated as threats to order. Their knowledge was dismissed or ridiculed, and in some cases they faced harassment or imprisonment for practicing their craft. Language was another major target. Children were often sent to boarding schools where speaking their native language was forbidden. Punishments ranged from isolation to physical discipline. Over time, this created a generational divide. Elders continued to speak their languages at home, while younger members of the community were taught to view them as backward or shameful. Clothing, hairstyles, and jewelry that reflected tribal identity were frequently banned or discouraged. Instead, Western-style dress codes and grooming standards were enforced, often as part of broader assimilation efforts by schools and churches. This process was not accidental. It was designed to replace indigenous belief systems with Christianity, indigenous languages with English, and traditional authority structures with colonial models. While many communities resisted and found ways to preserve their culture, the long-term damage was profound. No rights, no justice. As the American frontier expanded, indigenous people were not only pushed off their lands, they were also excluded from many of the legal protections afforded to settlers. Across much of the United States in the 19th century, Native communities were placed in a legal gray zone that made fair treatment under the law difficult, if not impossible. In several states and territories, laws specifically limited the ability of Native Americans to testify in court, particularly in cases involving white citizens. This meant that even if a settler committed theft, assault, or worse against an indigenous person, the testimony of the victim might not be admissible unless corroborated by a non-native witness. The result was a system where many crimes went unpunished, not due to lack of evidence, but because the law discounted the voices of those harmed. In California, the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians allowed local authorities to force Native people, including children, into unpaid labor arrangements. Framed as a form of apprenticeship, the law gave broad powers to settlers and effectively legalized forms of servitude. At the same time, it criminalized common aspects of Native life, such as loitering, hunting near settlements, or possessing firearms. On reservations, law enforcement was typically handled by Indian agents or military personnel. These officials often operated without clear oversight and held broad discretionary power. Accusations could lead to severe punishments, including imprisonment or public discipline, with little or no formal trial process. Efforts by indigenous nations to seek legal recourse were often blocked. When Native leaders attempted to challenge broken treaties or land seizures in court, they were sometimes told that they lacked standing, or that their nations were not recognized as full legal entities under U.S. law. A key legal classification, domestic dependent nations, placed tribes in a subordinate position, where their autonomy was acknowledged in name but not in practice. These legal frameworks were not simply oversights. They were part of a broader system that gave settlers near total control, while limiting the ability of Native communities to defend their rights, their property, or their people. Justice, for many indigenous Americans in the 19th century, was not only hard to obtain, it was often structurally out of reach. The final blow: executions and political control. After land was seized, communities displaced, and traditional cultures targeted, many indigenous nations faced one final form of control: the dismantling of their political autonomy. This was often carried out through forced leadership changes, suppression of traditional governance, and highly public displays of authority. One of the most consequential moments came in the aftermath of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota. Following a series of violent clashes sparked by broken treaties and lack of food, hundreds of Dakota men were captured by U.S. forces. Military tribunals were held quickly. Some trials lasted just minutes, More than 300 men were sentenced to death. But President Abraham Lincoln reviewed the cases and commuted most of the sentences. Even so, 38 Dakota men were executed on December 26, 1862, in what remains the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Thousands gathered to witness the event, which served as both punishment and public warning. Beyond the battlefield, the U.S. government began reshaping Native leadership structures. Traditional leaders were frequently bypassed in favor of individuals who supported government policies. These so-called friendly chiefs were often selected not by their communities, but by Indian agents or military officials. In exchange for their cooperation, they were sometimes granted additional rations, personal protection, or other privileges. The appointment of government-aligned leaders weakened internal cohesion and disrupted traditional forms of governance. In many nations, leadership roles had been based on spiritual authority, matriarchal lineage, or community consensus. These systems were replaced by models that mirrored Western hierarchies, often to the detriment of cultural continuity. Spiritual leaders and respected elders were sometimes sidelined or labeled as disruptive. Councils were restructured or dissolved altogether. In the absence of legitimate representation, some communities were left vulnerable to further land loss and exploitation. In addition, some Native groups were recruited, voluntarily or under pressure, to serve as scouts for the U.S. Army during campaigns against other tribes. While this allowed certain individuals or groups to gain favor or survive in a difficult system, it also introduced internal divisions that persisted for generations. Ultimately, the erosion of political independence was not simply about administration. It was about control. By limiting who could speak, decide, or lead, the government sought to shape not only what indigenous communities could do, but who they could be. The American frontier is often remembered as a land of opportunity, where determined settlers built new lives in untamed wilderness. But for indigenous peoples, it was also a period of profound loss, of land, of life, and of cultural integrity. The injustices they faced were not isolated incidents. They were the result of deliberate policies, systemic inequality, and institutional neglect. From forced relocations to withheld rations. From undermined leadership to cultural suppression, the legacy of these actions continues to shape lives today. Acknowledging this past is not about blame. It is about understanding. Only by confronting the full scope of history can we begin to honor the resilience of those who endured it and recognize the work that still lies ahead.